Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we are talking about the question of whether middle distance runners should try the dietary supplement creatine or whether it makes sense. In the first part of the lecture, I will introduce the essential functions of creatine, and in the second part of the lecture, I will talk about applications and the results, which only become meaningful and explainable in the light of this creative function. So first of all, let's look at the 5 functions of creatine, which can be represented from the biochemical circuit diagram. Orientation, we are here above the red line in the blood or below the red line in the muscle cell where the muscle contraction takes place. About 95% of creatine is found in muscle cells. What is creatine anyway? Creatine is structurally that formula here. That is, this is a methylguanidinoacetate. It can already be deduced from this structural formula that creatine is probably formed from arginine, methionine, and glycine. In fact, the body is able to produce about 1 to 2 grams of creatine per day in the connection between the kidneys and the liver. The liver then releases this amount of creatine into the blood, and creatine is then absorbed into the muscle cell via a creatine transporter. In addition to the endogenous biosynthesis of creatine, we consume about 1 to 2 grams of creatine per day in the form of animal foods. Creatine is not present in plant foods, so a total of about 2 or 3 grams of creatine flows into the muscle cell. And the same amount of creatine is then broken down in the muscle to creatinine, which is excreted in the urine. Creatine is present in the muscle cell in 2 different forms. In the inactive form, if you will, creatine, and in the active form, phosphocreatine. What is the function of this creatine in the context of muscle contraction? In muscle, during muscle contraction, ATP is cleaved into inorganic phosphate and ADP. This cleavage ultimately drives muscle contraction. Since the ATP pool in the muscle cell is very limited, it doesn't even last for 100 meters of run, a resynthesis of ATP must take place somehow. And phosphocreatine is responsible for this. The phosphocreatine transfers the phosphate group to the ADP so that ATP is again available for muscle contraction. This is the first function of creatine that I would like to mention here. It is therefore directly involved in the alactoside energy supply in the cell. The pool of ATP and phosphorus creatine is enough for 20, maybe 30 seconds. If you take a closer look at the reaction between phosphocreatine and ATP biochemically, you will find that in this reaction, a hydrogen ion is net formed. This means that the hydrogen ions produced in the course of muscle contraction, that is acidification of the muscle, is buffered by this reaction. And this is already the second function of creatine, namely that creatine serves as an intracellular buffer. Now, both the phosphocreatine pool and the ATP pool are ultimately limited. So there must be other energy supply systems in the cell to maintain muscle contraction under medium distance conditions. And anaerobic glycolysis is next responsible for this. Here, the glycogen is ultimately converted into stinging predator acid via intermediates such as glucose 1-phosphate and glucose 6-phosphate. Lactate is also formed, and this anaerobic glycolysis leads to the formation of ATP. Now the problem is that ATP formation here in anaerobic glycolysis takes place elsewhere locally than muscle contraction. This means that the synthesis of ATP and the consumption of ATP are spatially separated, and here now serves the creatine system for transporting energy to the place of consumption. In this case, creatine, the free creatine, reacts with ATP to form phosphocreatine. At the same time, ADP is produced, which in turn is then available in anaerobic glycolysis for ATP formation. The phosphocreatine, which has now been formed from anaerobic glycolysis, then serves here again for the resynthesis of ATP, so that we have the third function of creatine. It is involved in the lactic energy supply within the cell. Under medium distance conditions, however, not only the two anaerobic energy supply systems now play a role, but also the aerobic energy supply. And this is now shown here in the mitochondrion. We are now here within the muscle cell. Here, glycolysis, stinging grape acid into the mitochondrion, and ATP is formed via the citrate cycle and respiratory chain in the presence of oxygen. This aerobic energy supply also means that ATP formation and ATP consumption during muscle contraction are again locally separated from each other. And here too, the creatine system serves to transport energy from the place of origin, mitochondrion, to the place of consumption of muscle contraction. Here too, the free creatine with ATP to phosphocreatine to form ATP, which is then available again for the formation of ATP. And this phosphocreatine then serves again for the resynthesis of ATP for muscle contraction. So that the fourth function of creatine, the provision of ATP from aerobic energy synthesis. This means that creatine also has a function in aerobic energy supply. A fifth function of creatine can be derived here. It is the case that in the citrate cycle, or then in the respiratory chain during the synthesis of ATP, always a certain amount of reactive oxygen species, that is reactive oxygen compounds or oxygen radicals. This cannot be avoided in this reaction. And now we know that the faster ATP is removed via the creatine system, in species. Creatine has a fifth function here, namely it acts indirectly as an antioxidant. So we have 5 functions of creatine that are now relevant here for middle distance runners, namely the A-lactazide energy supply, the buffering of hydrogen ions during the acidification of the muscles during heavy exertion. The lactazide energy system is supported by creatine. So does the aerobic energy system, and it has an indirect function as an antioxidant. If this is the case now, and that the essential functions of creatine in the context of the middle insect, then two questions can be asked. Firstly, an increased intake of creatine, for example through supplements, can increase the intramuscular creatine concentration. That is the first question. And the second question, would this increase in the intramuscular creatine concentration then also lead to an improvement in these creatine functions and thus to an increase in performance? And these two questions, that is, increase the concentration of creatine in the muscle and improvement of these functions, accompanied by an increase in performance. I'll answer that now in the second part. Here you can see the intramuscular creatine concentration as a percentage represented under different conditions. Mixed foodist, that is, who eats plant food and plant-based food and animal foods. I have it here once 100%. This means that a mixed foodist has a 100% intramuscular creatine concentration. If you examine vegetarians or people who predominantly eat a plant-based diet or vegans, then the muscular creatine concentration is lowered to about 80%. From these very simple observations, which one has already, umpteen years ago, one can already deduce that obviously different intake of creatine is reflected in a different creatine muscle concentration. But that the endogenous synthesis in vegetarians, vegans, ensures that a certain amount of creatine is present in the muscle. From this observation, we can already expect that creatine supplementation may now lead to an increase in muscular creatine concentration. And that is indeed the case. This is the third bar here when you supplement creatine. Then there is a 20 for both vegetarians and mixed foodists. Up to 40% increase in intramuscular creatine concentration. You can see this effect of creatine supplementation to the intramuscular creatine concentration by supplementing this creatine with a meal, if you will. To be more precise, if you consume carbohydrates and or protein at the same time, then this increases the absorption of creatine into the muscle. Insulin is probably responsible for this. How long does it take to stop taking creatine after such a supplementation phase? This takes about 4 to 6 weeks. Then the initial values of creatine in the muscle are reached again. This creatine supplementation, if you look at it like this, of course the question arises, how much of creatine do you have to supplement now in order to achieve these increased muscular creatine concentrations? It has to be said that this depends to a certain extent on the muscle mass of a person and also on how large the percentage of type 2 fibers, that is the fast muscle cells. And the higher the muscle mass and the higher the proportional type 2 fiber, the more you would theoretically have to supplement. But there are simple standard protocols, which you can see here. And they usually lead to these increases. And such a standard protocol, there are two different types of. A protocol is associated with a so-called charging phase over a week. There will be 4 times 5 grams, so in 4 different portions, 5 each, grams of creatine given per day over a week. Even in this relatively short time, the specified increases are reached here. And then there is a maintenance phase with 3 to 5 grams per day, which then allows you to maintain these increased concentrations of creatine in the muscle. And as I said, if you were to stop taking it again, then after 4 to 6 weeks, the initial value would be reached again. Another simpler protocol would be to simply take 3 to 5 grams of creatine a day for about 4 weeks. And within those 4 weeks, these concentrations would be reached. So there are 2 different protocols that ultimately lead to the same result, namely a 20 up to 40% increase in intramuscular creatine concentration. The decisive question now is, of course, whether these increased muscular creatine concentrations also lead to an increase in performance. And here I have summarized the results of the study. First of all, creatine is a widely researched, or perhaps the best researched, dietary supplement. The number of studies of the original works is so large that it is difficult to keep track of all these original works in detail. Thank God there are corresponding reviews and reviews of creatine from international organizations such as EFSA, which is a commission of the European Union, which awards so-called claims for dietary supplements. Secondly, it is the International Society for Sports Nutrition and also the International Olympic Committee have summarized the creatine studies. All 3 international organizations come to the same conclusion, that one can assume an increase in the performance of creatine, now specified in the sense that the performance of short intervals, I'll get to the length in a moment, also increased by short intervals. This is shown by the vast majority of studies and the corresponding meta-analyses. That muscle building under hypertrophy training is improved by creatine supplementation as well as strength. This refers to both speed strength and maximum strength and power. Endurance and that interval loads with high intensity can also be performed with a larger training volume under creatine supplementation. If you now take a closer look at the point of high intensity, what loads were tested there? And then there are corresponding meta-analyses that have made evaluations regarding the duration of the load. Times a category below 30 seconds. So these are such tests as times 100 meter or something similar, short intervals between 30 and 150 seconds, or even longer intervals that are longer than seconds. Here, the arrows are now intended to symbolize how good the level of evidence is for an increase in performance at this length with appropriate interval training. And that's for short-term intervals, that is sprint discipline. The level of evidence is very high and the corresponding studies are very, very good. But also for these short-term intervals between 30 and 100%. The study situation is good. Even for the slightly longer intervals, the effect or number of studies that show positive effects is quite large for a dietary supplement. If you now try to quantify the effect at such intervals that were tested there under creatine supplementation, I once let myself be carried away to summarize it like this. And you could say that for these sprint intervals, there is an average of all studies, maybe a 10% effect. With these short intervals, maybe 5%. And also at the longer intervals in the VO2 max range, still 2%. All these increases would ultimately be relevant at a certain level. These studies that have been done here with regard to performance enhancement are one part. Nevertheless, there is a very large proportion of studies or integrated into these corresponding sports studies that possible side effects of creatine. And the first thing to mention is the possible weight gain under creatine. However, this is sometimes not present in many studies. In some cases it is present, but is mentioned relatively often. Often it is also an initial weight gain, which is on average about 1 kilo. This may be worth noting. Further studies regarding, for example, kidney function and metabolic parameters have led to the conclusion, which these international organizations have also concluded, that creatine is considered safe in the sense that there are a number of studies that had an observation period of more than 5 years, where corresponding people, which were mostly people who had certain metabolic diseases and with whom one tried to improve these metabolic diseases through creatine. There you have 30 grams per day creatine, and in these long-term studies no irregularities or disorders could be observed with regard to kidney function and metabolism. On the contrary, it is even the case that in professional societies, beyond the performance enhancement of creatine, that creatine is also discussed for neuromuscular health or neuromuscular health in old age in particular. So overall, the study situation is, in terms of a performance enhancing effect in the range from sprint to short time, and sometimes also longer intervals, quite convincing. So that on the basis of these studies and the creatine function, can now also come to a conclusion. That is, my conclusion is now based on the presented 5 creatine functions that are interesting for the middle distance range and the study situation, or the study results on creatine with regard to performance enhancement. You could just say that creatine for middle distance runners, you can say more precisely from 800 meters to 5,000 meters, including the 3,000 meter obstacle course, is certainly an interesting supplement, of which it is worth testing once. And performance increases are to be expected even if and especially if these runners are vegetarians or people who are predominantly plant-based. Nourish. The corresponding increases in intramuscular creatine concentration are greater than in omnivores, so the effect may also be greater. And strong and particularly fast middle distance runners with a lot of type 2 and a relatively large muscle mass. For example, the fast 800-meter runners. For them, this is particularly interesting from my point of view, so to speak, so that you can already draw conclusions. It is worth creatine once in the middle distance area, here in this sense, in the top area, where other areas such as training, regeneration work have been exhausted to test this creatine once. Of course, the safety instructions regarding dietary supplements. Keyword colon, list or the recommendations of the International Olympic Committee on which dietary supplements you should take and what you should check regarding a contamination with doping agents. This is not the scope of the lecture here, but I have to point it out, so to speak, and that such a creatine supplementation for medium distance training is particularly suitable from my point of view, results from the broad requirements that middle distance training entails. Middle distance training in particular is a combination of sprint training, maximum strength training, strong anaerobic elements, but also aerobic elements. And this wide range of requirements, which is now almost present in middle distance training practically all year round, corresponds to the wide range of functions of creatine. And if you take a closer look, then you would have to say that in speed endurance training units, in short-term anaerobic intervals, but overall intervals that are up to 100% VO2 max, corresponding increases are to be expected in training so that you may be able to train a little harder, practically more voluminous in this area under creatine. Also for middle distance runners who have the so-called HIT blocks, that is high intensity training blocks, nowadays it plays a greater role in the propagated bipolar training that such HIT blocks are made even in such blocks. With intensities in the range of 100% VO2 max, it may be worthwhile to test creatine once. And this creatine supplementation in these training sessions or in these blocks should of course be tested with a test competition or several test competitions. Try. So all in all, my plea for creatine to be tried in such a top area, and I hope I have been able to show you overall how interesting it is when you look at the functions of creatine and then practically place them on the requirement profile of the middle distance runner. Then take into account the study situation so that I think you come to a relatively clear conclusion that it is at least worth trying creatine in the middle distance range. Yes, I hope you enjoyed the video and you have new insights into the features of creatine. If you have any questions or comments, you can always write them to my email address or leave a comment on YouTube. I would be very happy about that. I will always try to answer questions. Thank you for your attention.